Welcome to another episode of the Animals at Home podcast. I hope your day is going well so far. Before we jump into today's episode, I just wanted to cover a couple quick topics. The first was we received some unfortunate news this week from ARC, that's the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. They had actually found some evidence of illegal logging taking place on the land that they have protected. So if you're unfamiliar with ARC, they are a charity, a Canadian charity that protects sections of the Peruvian rainforest. Animals at Home is a sponsor of ARC, and we make donations based off of the revenue that we receive through the YouTube channel and the website and whatnot. And earlier this month, they actually found some evidence of trees that had been knocked down by loggers, which is really unfortunate. And at this point, ARC is really trying their best to raise enough money in order to have someone that can permanently live on the land. So have someone that can patrol the land on a daily basis, and actually they would build a small structure for them to live and maybe have rotating people that can spend 100% of the time on the land. So if you are interested in helping that project, make sure you go to amazonrainforestconservancy.com and you can make a donation there. And you also know that supporting Animals at Home does also support ARC. So if you want to buy an Animals at Home t-shirt, $5 will be immediately donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And we're actually looking at working on some new colors for the sweaters that we have. We have a couple crew neck sweaters, just a very basic design. I'm hoping to have those colors out next week if I can. So keep an eye out for that. And if you want a sweater, $5 will go to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And hopefully we can stop these illegal loggers from chopping down trees, because a lot of these trees are endangered. And as soon as the last one is cut down, that will be the last one. If you are enjoying the Animals at Home podcast so far, definitely consider going to the Apple podcasting app on your phone or on iTunes and giving us a 5-star rating. We would really, really appreciate it. All right, so we're going to jump into today's episode. I am very excited to share this episode with you guys. It is one of the first episodes where I've really stepped outside of the reptile hobby. If you remember back on episode 5, I believe it was, we did an episode with Nancy from SciBugs, and she's an entomologist. But I'm sure you'll agree that there's a lot of crossover between the reptile enthusiasts and bug enthusiasts and insect enthusiasts. So this is one where we're really stepping right outside of that, and it's something that I've really wanted to do with the show. And even from day one, I said this show wasn't going to be just about reptiles. We're going to talk about all animals, because I think there's just so much more we can expose ourselves to. And sometimes you might think like, wow, why would I care about this subject? And then you listen to an expert or someone who's passionate talk about it, and you have a completely different perspective on it. And I think that is what this show should be for. We should open up doors into different areas, and maybe you'll learn something today that you had no idea that you'd find interest in before this. So today I'm talking with Dr. Kaeli Swift. Dr. Swift received her Ph.D. from the University of Washington, and her research revolves around the genus Corvus, which is your crows, your ravens, and your jackdaws. And today you're going to learn a ton about crows and ravens. And if you're like the average person that I would run into, most people don't really care about crows or ravens or find them kind of disturbing or disgusting. I think that's kind of the main meme that seems to permeate our culture around these birds. But I promise you, after listening to this episode, you will have a totally new respect and a totally new vision for these animals when you see them. Crows and ravens are some of the most social and intelligent birds on the planet, and Dr. Swift tells us all about different evidence and a lot of the research that she's done. And I don't want to say too much about it. I just want to let her tell the stories, because it is really, really incredible. And as we discussed in the episode, and I'm sure you're aware of this as well, crows and ravens are all over our ancient stories and mythologies. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about this group of birds, is that the relationship that they have to humans is ancient. There's something about them that really speaks to humans on a different level. And I think this conversation really opens up some of that if you're somebody that has not really paid attention to these animals before. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. Hi, I'm Dylan, and you're listening to the Animals at Home podcast. All right, well, Dr. Swift, thank you very much for joining me today. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Well, I have recently discovered Instagram is a fantastic place to find guests. I don't use Instagram myself personally, so I've just kind of got into this. And there's so many people out there like yourself who have these amazing pages. So I was happy that you responded so quickly. And once a guest or someone that I've asked to come on the show tells me that they would like to come on the show, that's when I really start kind of digging into their research. And I didn't realize, but you've been on some really big podcasts. You've been on the Duncan Trussell and the Ologies.
I have, yeah. I'm really fortunate that the topic that I study, which is broadly corvids, so that's the family of birds that includes crows and jays and ravens. And then more specifically, the stuff that I was doing as a graduate student, which just ended very recently, looked at crow funeral behaviors. So I'm really lucky in that both of those topics, corvids, which are a bird that a lot of people are familiar with because they live in human dominated areas, and this idea of, crow funerals are both really accessible topics. They're one that I think people are naturally curious about. And because they're so accessible, even if they don't really know much about these birds to begin with, they get sort of sucked into these stories. And so that provides this great avenue for me to talk to a lot of interesting people like yourself and get the general public really excited about these birds.
Yeah, it's definitely something that the general public can gravitate towards, I think. And obviously this being a much smaller show than those other ones, I'm very grateful that you said that you would come on it. And I think that's probably a testament to how engaged you are in the work that you do. Obviously, you really love what you're doing.
I do. Yeah. And any opportunity to talk about it, big or small, is always welcomed.
Well, we appreciate it. So how does somebody get into crows? Do you remember, was there a moment that you remember that you thought, wow, maybe this is something that I could take this a little bit further?
There was definitely a moment. So and it kind of depends on how far you want to go back. So we'll very, very quickly go all the way back to the beginning. And I have always loved animals. And when I was a kid, it was like wool. I was really into wolves. And then as I grew up and started to think more about kind of more the questions that inspired me rather than the specific kinds of animals, the themes always seem to revolve around this idea of the social intelligence hypothesis. This question that when we think about the animals that are sort of demonstrably more cognitively advanced, so things like dolphins and elephants, et cetera, they all share this common thread of having these really complex social lives. So there's this question about kind of what is the relationship between those two things in terms of how being incredibly social may facilitate and kind of push the needle on our cognitive demands. And at the same time, I was sort of thinking about all of that and loving animals. I really, really loved birds. And so in college, that's when I first started to read. I read Mind of the Raven, which is a terrific book by Bernd Heinrich. And from there, I started reading more academic papers, kind of looking at crows and ravens as a model for asking some of these questions about social intelligence and cognition and all those kinds of things. And that was sort of my aha moment of realizing that that researching these birds were sort of the best marriage of all of these different things that really drew my interest. Interesting.
Yeah, it's that is the interesting thing about those social creatures. I totally can relate, where the more social an animal seems to be, the more cognitively developed they seem to be.
Yeah, and the reason for that is being social is really hard. And we can, as people, we can empathize with that on sort of a theoretical level, right? But we also can, when we step out of it, a lot of the things we do every day that maybe we take for granted, but if we sort of step back and think about them, are really hard. We're constantly juggling a lot. In our relationships, right? You need to be able to think about all of the positive experiences you've had with a person, the negative ones, how much you trust them, that's based off of all of these things. And that's actually a lot of work for your brain.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre when you start looking at these behaviors in animals, because especially social animals, you can see a lot of human behavior in other animals, and we'll get into that as well. But then you start to think, consciousness does not seem to be a prerequisite for some of these behaviors. Obviously, different animals have varying levels of what you might say is conscious, but it's almost like humans give ourselves more credit for some of these behaviors that we're exhibiting. We have these social behaviors, and it almost seems like because we're conscious, we're the ones that are dictating and deciding to behave in these ways. But then you can see animals behaving in the same way with a much less or lower level of awareness, seemingly anyway.
Yeah, that's totally. So one of the when we think about how we study animal cognition and intelligence, I mean, obviously, when we talk about intelligence, that can be a very loaded word. But from a scientific perspective, basically, what we're interested in is how much is trying to make that distinction and understand how much animals actually understand about what they're doing. Because one of the things that I think creates a lot of confusion is that there are many behaviors which ultimately result in what seems like a sophisticated action that are actually guided by a series of very simple mechanisms. And my best analogy for this is ants, right? Like ants as a group are capable of achieving amazing, complex things. But they don't do that because they like have a meeting at the beginning of every day and they're like, all right, we got to tackle, right? Like there's a series of essentially lock and key steps where every ant does its job. Collectively, you have a beautiful, amazing end result. And so what we have to do when we're looking at behaviors and from a, trying to determine intelligence standpoint is something like that what's going on? Is it these simple mechanisms that result in this really complex outcome? Or is there something more to it where animals are maybe thinking about this in a way that's more consistent with consciousness or some of these abilities like causal reasoning that we know are more cognitively advanced.
Right. Yeah. No, it's very interesting. So is that part of the reason that you used, we can talk about some of the research that you've done in terms of the death, the crow funerals and the danger research that you've done. Is that just a good place to test some of that intelligence, based off of the species that you're working with? Is it obviously when you're watching them, it sort of looks like they're having a funeral, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that research a little bit.
Yeah. So let me just intro that to your listeners. So, for many generations of people, we have known that crows and other corvids pay really close attention to their dead. So that idea in and of itself wasn't something that I contributed to science or to the discussion of crows at large. But what we haven't really until very recently started to understand is why they do this. And basically what the behavior looks like is when a crow dies, and it is discovered by another crow, that bird will produce an alarm call, and then that alarm call results in the recruitment of other birds to the area to form what we call a mob, which if you've ever seen crows go after like a raptor in the sky or your cat or whatever, like you've seen that behavior. So that's what they do. We know that they've done that for a long time. And so my research, though, wanted to dive in more to this idea of like, why? What could be motivating this behavior? Because we could explain it any number of ways. Maybe it's them taking advantage of a social opportunity, right? These are very social birds. Maybe they want to investigate who died so that they can sort of reevaluate their own positions in the social hierarchy or see who's available to remate. Maybe they're really sad, right? This is a totally emotional response akin to something that we would feel. Or one of the other explanations, which is the one that I looked at because it was the best one, it was sort of the most conducive to a well-crafted scientific approach, was this idea of danger, learning, and avoidance. This idea that maybe they gather around dead birds because they want to know how it was killed so that they don't meet the same fate. So, and in the course of doing that research, basically what we did is we would feed crows in a particular area for a couple of days. We'd introduce a person holding a dead crow, and then we'd keep feeding them for another couple of days. And then after about a week, we'd bring that same person back. Now, without the dead crow, they're just kind of hanging out, but in that same area. And we found that crows both showed wariness in the area associated with that dead body, even after it had been taken away, meaning that during those first 3 days when we were feeding them, they were like coming down right away to that food pile. They're like, yes, give me those peanuts, I'm ready. And then after that funeral event, now they're like, I really want those peanuts, but I'm like kind of nervous because there was a dead crow here yesterday. And I don't know. But that was one way that we were able to demonstrate that they're learning about places and making these dangerous associations. And then the last one is once we did bring that person back, they started to treat them like a predator. So rather than just ignoring them, which is what they normally do to, a person who they have no interest in, now they're alarm calling, they're dive bombing them, they're doing all these things. So with that experiment, we helped demonstrate that although there could still be other reasons they do this behavior, it's not mutually exclusive. Definitely a part of it is this idea that they are, that they have these experiences and then they're learning from them in order to better navigate their environment and in order to avoid death.
Right, which it makes total sense. And it's really bizarre for, I think, humans. If you have not studied these animals before, it seems like such an advanced behavior. You think like people that don't know anything about birds, they're just like, they seem kind of dumb. Like, it's what people call bird brains all the time and whatnot. But it is really incredible that they can do that. And by the way, the masks that the subjects wore, like if anyone's curious, they can look on your Instagram page and there's a picture, I think if you scroll down, of the masks that you guys use. I think you just use masks just to sort of neutralize the expressions on the...
There was actually a couple of reasons we used the masks. So, and I will, I'll post a picture in coincident with when you publish this podcast so that people don't have to scroll down so far.
Sure.
So we can coordinate that. But there were a couple of reasons in our study that we used them. The main one was actually purely logistic. So I was always off taking data, right? I was never the dangerous, threatening person holding the crow because I needed to be off, like recording how many birds were around and the sounds they were making, all that. So I had volunteers fill that role. And my volunteers were primarily undergrads who were doing this because they want to participate in science. They're not getting paid, and therefore they have absolutely no obligation to keep doing it week after week. It's totally reasonable. Mm-hmm. And, people just have different schedules. But because that timing of sending somebody out holding the dead crow and then making sure that they were available a week later was so important, the way that I compensated for not knowing if Jenny, let's say Jenny was my volunteer for the funeral event, if she wasn't going to be available in a week, but Tim was, the best way that I could make that work is if I used masks, because that way it did not matter who was volunteering for me. The face that the crows were seeing, and based off previous work that my advisor, John Merzliff, has done, we know that when it comes to recognizing people, the face is the thing they key in on the most. As long as I could keep that consistent with masks, I could have anyone volunteer for me. And it didn't matter how closely in size, shape, or skin color they resembled the person who had helped previously. As long as that face is the same, the crows are fooled.
Right. Yeah.
That was one of the big reasons. But then, like you said, just making sure that the expression was neutral the whole time. We weren't indicating any nefariousness because somebody's like frowning, or we weren't being too silly with it because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm out here holding a dead crow. This is so weird, or anything like that. And then the other added benefit is it kept the identity of my volunteers anonymous so that they were not then the focus of the crow's future ire. they could then stroll those streets in peace.
Right. They weren't going to be on the hit list from the crows.
Exactly.
But the mask, I mean, the whole scene of this masked individual holding a dead crow is very creepy looking from an outsider's perspective. I'm sure people walking by, because it's like this hair and this kind of stationary mask, but obviously there's some good reasons for it.
Yeah, it was a great opportunity and conversation starter to talk about science with people out on the sidewalk.
There you go. See, that makes sense. So when you are the person that's doing the recording, I know when I read through the papers, obviously you're sitting in one spot or you're watching for quite a long time, several hours. As a researcher, what is that like? Obviously, not everybody is a scientist, so people aren't fully aware of how much time and focus it takes to run through these types of experiments.
Oh, it was, it could be really torturous, to be honest.
I bet.
So my first year of doing this research, the study, which came out in 2015, was based off of 2 field seasons. So 2 full summer months over the course of 2 different years, obviously. And my first one, my field sites were primarily in downtown Seattle. And I think by the end, I can't quite remember our total sample size, but it was in the neighborhood of about 300, I think. So that's 300 different territories that I have to find and places that I have to be. And like you said, what one of the things that we were tracking was this idea that they may or may not become wary to the place. So to evaluate that, I had to stand there for up to 2.5 hours to see if they would come down for this food. And that was maybe sometimes in addition to having already been out there for 2 hours, just waiting for the birds to come in and then see the mask, blah, blah, blah. And I'm doing that at multiple field sites every day. So the time really added up. I could easily have a 15-hour work day. And because, like I said, because we were in downtown Seattle, not all of the places where these birds choose to nest are super comfortable places for a lone person to stand for 3 hours. Like they may just physically be uncomfortable because there's no place to sit, or it may be uncomfortable for other reasons because of the atmosphere. But suffice it to say, I got through it and I learned a lot about the city of Seattle and the people that call that city their home. And by and large, actually, I had really great experiences with all of the people who interacted with me. I had a few not so great experiences, but yeah, it was something I'll never forget. That's for sure.
Yeah, it definitely requires a ton of dedication to be able to do those things properly, those types of experiments. So people listening may not be aware of how intelligent crows are. And obviously we've kind of touched on it a little bit at this point. So what are some things that people would be surprised by to hear that crows are capable of doing in terms of the way they learn or their just basic intelligence?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, so one thing that I want to caveat this answer with is, so when we talk about crows and ravens, people are going to think of whatever species of crow or raven is the one that lives with them, right? So in North America, generally when I say I study crows, people are going to think of American crows. And they may not realize or just not remember that there are in total 45 different species of crows and ravens. And so when we talk about some of the things that crows are capable of, sometimes it comes across like that's an ability that's generalized among all of those birds, but it's actually in many cases unique to only one or two species. So the best example, and the one that I really think is the most amazing, is tool use. So New Caledonian crows, so that's a species that lives on an island off the coast of New Zealand called New Caledonia. They make tools very similar to the ones chimpanzees make. So they'll take the edge of these special plants called pandanus plants, and they'll strip the edge off. They're very stiff plants with a serrated edge, like a steak knife. And they'll make these strips and they'll use those to probe into bark, and then the teeth of that serrated edge will catch insects and pull them out. And they also make hooks. And so because of this behavior, the headline that you'll see is crows make tools and they're so amazing. And that's true. But I just want to remind your listeners that it's true that New Caledonian crows do that. But most other species of crows and ravens, we have never documented doing anything close to tool use. So anyway, that's kind of a tedious, annoying science answer, but I always got to drive that message home that when we talk about cool things that they do, it's not necessarily family-wide.
Right.
But anyways.
And a lot of the species to the average person probably look very close to the same anyway as well. So that kind of makes it a little more challenging. Exactly.
So it's okay. So you as a listener, you don't need to be an expert on all of this stuff, but just have it in the back of your mind that even though we use very general language when talking about what these birds are capable of, actually it's usually very species specific. So anyway, right. So tool use, that is an amazing one. I mean, give me a break. They're literally, it's chimpanzees and crows when it comes to making tools. There's a lot of different animals that use tools.
That is unbelievable.
It right? It is, especially because, as you said earlier in the podcast, the term bird brain has for so long been used as a insult to describe, somebody as not being very smart, because really historically we didn't think birds were very smart. I mean, their brains are so much smaller than ours. And their brains are actually structurally quite different than the mammalian brain. And so we had this misconception for decades and decades and decades that these animals, they're just little robots flying around in the sky. And yeah, it's through a lot of this work, specifically focusing on corvids, but some other species too, parrots are another one, where we're realizing, I mean, just how wrong we were about that. And so the tool use is a great indication of that. Imagination. So being able to sort of play out scenarios in your mind that aren't actually happening in front of you. I mean, for us as people, right, we do that all the time. It's like, whatever. But actually, cognitively, that's a really challenging thing to do. It's also scientifically very difficult to show might be happening in other animals, but we have some really good evidence, in my opinion, of that happening in particularly ravens, as demonstrated by their ability to seemingly sort of picture birds spying on them, for example, to sort of play out a scenario where they're being spied on, even if they can't see another bird watching them. So their ability to use tools, to use their imagination. And then one of the other big ones is just their really keen sense of what we call causal reasoning, right? This idea of cause and effect. And that is a big part of many of the different species of crows and ravens. Their ability to problem solve in these really effective ways is because they really seem to show a great deal of insight into how a problem works so that they can be flexible and kind of solve it in interesting and new ways as is needed by their environment.
Yeah, that is really mind-blowing, actually. And just for people that aren't super familiar, I think crows and ravens, they're all under the same, is it the same genus and then just their species, or are ravens a different genus than crows?
Great question. So Corvidae is the family that includes crows, ravens, and magpies. Corvus is the genus that includes crows, ravens, rooks, and jackdaws. And then within that Corvus genus, you have the 45 different species where you can have American crow and fish crow and jungle crow and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, gotcha. So in something like the ones that are actually making tools, and I think New Caledonia, how does something like that happen? Like, do you guys have an idea of how that behavior develops? I mean, obviously yes. Islands are kind of weird. There's always weird things happening on islands, so maybe that has part to do with it, but...
Totally. You totally got it. So
yes.
I know. Good job.
Thank you.
So it is the crux of the story is islands. So I'll ask you another question in a second. But basically the story on New Caledonia is that you have this island, and on New Caledonia there are no woodpecker species, which means that you have this niche of these big, like, juicy grubs and other bugs, like hiding under the, rotting wood of logs and all that kind of stuff that wasn't really being exploited by another species. But obviously, like crows, they can't just like go hammering into some wood because they get brain damage. They don't have the physiology that woodpeckers do to protect their brains.
Right. And
so if you're going to exploit that resource, you need to get creative. And so you had this selection pressure that resulted in just sort of a phenomenal level of creativity. So my follow-up question is, there is, and I'll pose this to your listeners too, there is one other species that within the last couple of years, one other crow species that within the last couple of years has also in captivity been demonstrated to make tools. And this is another island-dwelling crow. So I'll put it to your reader or your listeners to guess and see if they can think of what far away island that doesn't have any woodpeckers might there be a crow that also makes tools.
It's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer to it. Maybe we'll just leave it up to them and let them go do some investigations on their own. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. Very cool. So that's really incredible. So it's amazing how those islands do that. They just sort of push species into these unbelievable feats that we would never think that's possible, really.
Yeah.
So I know part of the things that I found really interesting was the way that the crows seem to be able to communicate with each other and almost pass on information. So I know I had listened to your colleague John's TED Talk, and I think he used the masks as making these I guess put people with masks on, and the crows interpreted as being dangerous. But then generations later, crows are still mobbing these masks as if they're dangerous. How are they transmitting information across generations?
So that is a great question, and one that I have seen has sort of developed or given rise to a lot of misconceptions. So in the study that John was describing in that TED Talk, that was the original facial recognition study where they wore the same types of masks that I used in my research, and they would capture crows. And they would wear the masks while they captured them, and then they would put leg bands on them so they could individually mark these birds, and then they would let them go, right? And so the experience of being captured is not life-threatening, but it's real scary for a crow. And so that was a really sort of salient experience of like staring into the face of the thing you think is going to murder you, but then off they go back into the wild. And the reason it was so important to attach those leg bands is because that's how they were able to track, okay, we expect that if that individual crow now with red over green on their leg, if they see this mask, we definitely expect that they will freak out. But what they found was it wasn't just when they encountered red over green, but now at first it's like a few unbanded crows. And then the next time it's more unbanded crows, more and more. And now it's the offspring of that first crow. So what they found in that study was two forms of learning, horizontal and vertical learning. And what I mean by that is sort of a peer-to-peer, like a within generation, same generation learning. That's horizontal, right? Versus vertical is when you're going from one generation to the next. And we still don't have a great explanation for how they're passing that information on. It's very not likely to be like after the fact where they're all sitting in a tree and they're like, oh my gosh, this, wild thing happened to me. I saw this woman and she had curly red hair and she's horrible. And so if you see her, right, it's probably that when red over green initially saw that person again and was freaking out, other crows came over and were like, what are you freaking out about? And by way of that crow really directing that negative energy towards that person, other crows observing were like, okay, we don't necessarily know why you're so mad at this person, but like, okay, we are on board with this train. We will also be mad at that person because clearly they did something bad. And so It's probably just actually in the moment observing them directing that energy. Now, one of the interesting sort of like doesn't quite follow up pieces of that though is, we did this experiment on the University of Washington campus where you could have these max people walking through, the quad when classes get out and it's filled with other people. And yet still they seem to know which was the right person, even in that crowd. And that's one of the parts that is totally still mysterious to us.
Interesting. So you're like the mysterious part about that being that they are capable of distinguishing these masked individuals inside a crowd?
And that the other birds were learning from that experience.
Oh, I gotcha.
Which is the right one. Yeah, like how, because in that moment, the bird is like freaking out. So if they're the only one out, then it's easy. They're like, right, they're freaking out. There's only one person outside. Of course, the observing birds are going to learn which one. But if that person is surrounded by 20 other people, how among that crowd are they like, no, it's that's the one that I'm mad at.
Right.
And we don't quite know the answer to that. And so for many people, the answer might seem obvious. They're like, well, they probably advertise it somehow in the calls, right? Because there's lots of animals that have what we call referential calling, meaning predator-specific calls. Like chickadees do, vervet monkeys, prairie dogs. There's lots of different animals that can say like, hawk is coming or snake is coming. But really fascinatingly, we have not been able to show that with crows. And I cannot tell you, crow calls, that's like one of the sources that I get asked the most about. And that is the one that I like have to most routinely disappoint people about when I'm like, I don't know what it means. Because crow vocalizations are just kind of like the black box of this research area where we put so much time and energy into it and just get nothing out. So it's fascinating. We don't know. We don't know how they're advertising these nuanced details because there's nothing about the calls that indicate that to us the way that we've been able to suss out those things in other species.
Yeah, I mean, I love that because it poses such interesting questions. It's almost like they have a sort of a classical conditioning on steroids where they immediately learn a stimulus, but then you have that added piece about how are they distinguishing it. Because crows and ravens actually have a very wide spectrum of vocalizations that people might not realize. They only hear them yelling at you, but which people kind of get annoyed at, but they do have way more range than we might think.
Yeah, and there's a number that gets pushed around sometimes when I read articles from like Nat Geo or PBS that they have like 47 different calls or something. I don't know. There's always a number that I see and I'm like, I don't know where they get this number from, but whatever is the actual number, it is, many tens of difference of calls. And so I encourage people, if they've never taken the time, like on a quiet afternoon, to just like watch crows for a little bit, to do it because they'll hear a lot of these really soft, in some cases, really beautiful sounds that, if you're just like strolling by the crows and ignoring them, or, if you only ever otherwise see them on like a busy street, you may miss. But yeah, they make a lot of calls and they're not all like just the harsh classic ones that, we're conditioned to from TV and stuff.
Yeah, like 6 a.m. My dad always gets mad at these crows because there's a crow at his place that always yells at his dogs, and he's like, "I swear this crow is messing with the dog because they're always barking and yelling at each other." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know, that sounds wrong." But then now that I look more into this research, it actually seems like the crow probably is messing with the dog.
No, they really do love to tease dogs, and I think that is from a long history of teasing wolves. And the relationship between corvids and wolves is another one that's unfortunately way over romanticized and has sort of taken on a life of its own that's not really scientifically validated. So basically, like, there's a ton of memes out there. And if you ask people who love ravens, this will be a common answer that ravens and wolves have these symbiotic relationships where ravens will lead wolves to carcasses and then the wolves rip them open and the ravens get to eat them and like kumbaya, they love each other. And actually all of the science has shown that is a very one-way road where the ravens are like, I love following wolves around. This is great, free meal. And the wolves are like, oh my gosh, get out of here. I'm going to murder you. And actually so to me, the real story is so much more fascinating than the myth because there's a number of studies that have shown that it might actually be that the theft pressure from ravens on wolf kills is so intense that that's actually pushed wolf packs to be larger than is sort of the most efficient because they need those extra bodies there to keep the ravens away. So wolves and ravens actually have this very intense relationship. It's just not the symbiotic one. It's more of a kleptoparasitism one.
Yeah.
And so because of that, though, you'll also see lots of sort of teasing and infighting between ravens and wolves ravens, one of the things that they'll do is that they love to pull tails, and they'll pull all kinds of animals' tails, but especially wolves. And one of the reasons they definitely do it is it's a distraction tool. So you'll have one bird go in, it will tail pull, the wolf will turn to like get it. And then in that moment where it's turned away from the carcass, other ravens will go in to steal. But they might also do it as like a social theater thing, because they get killed sometimes trying to pull those shenanigans. Wolves will turn around and they'll be quick enough that they'll kill these ravens. And so I think because of that history of sort of using dogs as a way to demonstrate maybe your, agility or dominance, anything like that. And just because of the association of dogs with food, I think there is definitely, and that's translated to crows, there is definitely this relationship there of like when crows see a dog, they want to go and like mess with it.
Which is hilarious. And
it is.
And ravens are, like, people might be thinking if they've never seen a raven before, they might not understand how they might steal food from a wolf, but they are quite a bit larger than your sort of average American crow.
Yeah, they're 2.5 times the size of a crow. They are big birds, like raptor-sized birds. And they've got these enormous, powerful bills. And oh yeah, it's scary. I visited a non-releasable raven at one point, and it was like mostly cool. It was a little kind of like, I don't know, you're in my territory, and like you're not my my bonded person, so like I'm not. Like gave me a few pecks on the knee, but at one point I had a raptor glove on, and I had it on my arm, and I was able to get a picture, and it's basically be like holding out my arm as far away from my body as possible, and my head is like leaning as far in the opposite direction, because once it got that close to me, I was just like, you could just like tear my eyes from my sockets in like a half second if you wanted to. And so these are powerful birds, and next to a wolf, I mean, they're still going to look, it's going to look like a crow and a mid-sized dog. That'll sort of be the proportion when you have a raven next to a wolf. But yeah, and a tail, like a snap from a raven's beak, yikes, that hurts. So yeah, that's an effective way to get an animal's attention, no matter how big or powerful it otherwise is.
Oh, definitely, yeah. There's ravens and crows are just permeated all over mythologies. I think in like almost every culture all over the place. And why is that? Is that because they seem to follow people, or what's going on there?
Great question. So yes is the first answer. Crows and ravens exist on every continent, with really the exception of South America. There are corvids down in South America, but there aren't any Corvus species, so meaning crows or ravens, but there's like jays and stuff. But basically, otherwise, in every other part of the world, these birds existed. And crows especially are what we call synanthropes, meaning an animal that really benefits from the presence of people. So these are animals that aren't just like sort of figuring out how to make the urbanized landscape work for them. They're like, this is my landscape. This is what I like. They like associating with people, and they always have. And so, yeah, because of that, there has been this relationship basically from the beginning where these birds have followed us around. And because of that, just their literal physical proximity to us, but also because, as we've discussed, they exhibit a lot of these behaviors that are so charismatic and so familiar. I think they lend themselves really well to being incorporated into creation stories and mythology, because we can see a lot of ourselves in them once we start paying attention to them.
Right. But if for some reason, I feel like in modern day, a lot of people just don't like crows. I don't know if it's because they're scavengers or what, but like I think after listening to this, people might change their mind and might go out and look at crows. But quite often they're seen as like dirty and whatnot. Do you think that you just associated with the fact that they tend to be a scavenger, or?
If you look at scavengers as a group, on the whole, they definitely really unfairly get that reputation, right? And in fact, they're doing, we owe everything to the scavengers. We owe our existence to them. We should give them more respect. But yeah, unfortunately, I think anytime you have an animal that's, getting in with the meat that repulses us, the kinds of feeding situations that repulses us, that sense of repulsion then carries along with the identity of the animal as a whole. And I think for crows and ravens, really historically, the most important sort of turning point was during the era of things like the plague, and basically any other time where you had these mass human casualties, where you just had bodies everywhere, because that's going to attract a lot of these scavengers. And if there's one thing, really, especially in Western cultures, that we don't like, it's seeing our dead be consumed by animals. That's like a huge, that really has this intense trigger for humans, in those kinds of cultures at least. And so I think during those times, the Crusades, like I said, any period like that where you had a lot of dead bodies out, and these attacks from or I shouldn't call them attacks, but you had crows and ravens opportunistically scavenging on that food source, that's a big turnoff. And so I think that's where we then really sort of turned on them a little bit, because we were like, stop eating us.
Yeah, that makes sense. But, it's so interesting, like after reading your work and even having this conversation, like now I just feel like I can't wait to go out and look for some crows. And it's interesting how different your perspective can be once you learn more about them.
For sure. And, some of the behaviors that if you do spend some time watching them that you're very likely to see that are really the antithesis of munching on dead people are things like playing. So these are one of the few species of birds that we know play even well into adulthood. And it's really fun to see the little games that they come up with. So as an example, in Seattle, we have these ornamental trees that are planted like all over our city parks and downtown and stuff. And they produce these sort of ping pong sized cones, and they're round. And like I said, it's just like a ping pong. And one day I was walking around and I saw this crow, and it had one of those in its bill, and it would fly up maybe like 10 or 15 meters off the ground, and then it would drop it. And then right before it hit the ground, it would go diving after it and grab it. And then it would fly back up, let it fall. And then right before it hit the ground, it would pick it up. So it's not doing this to like crack it and get food or anything like that, because it's very intentionally not letting it hit the ground. It was just this little like game it was playing with itself. And this conversation is great timing, because we're right about to get into the breeding season, which is going to start in March for most people in the United States anyway. And then once we hit about June, that's when all of the babies will leave the nest. And the babies, they have the best games. They're the ones to watch, because they're just like, if you want to see animals picking on other animals, you watch the baby crows, because they go after the pigeons, they go after the dogs. They're just waiting to cause trouble wherever they can.
Can you tell, is a baby, I think the plumage of a young crow must be very similar to an adult. Is it just, you can just tell by being the animal is smaller itself?
No, so that's a really common misconception. So most birds, by the time they leave the nest, are basically their adult size in terms of body weight. They'll put on a little bit more, but by and large, they're actually very similar to an adult size. And whatever differences there are going to be pretty hard to detect unless you have a lot of experience. So with crows, and ravens, the best way to tell there's a few key features. The first one is called the gape. So baby birds, when they open their mouth, have these really brightly colored mouth linings. And that basically acts as a signal to their parents of like, feed me, right? They open their mouth and they see that bright yellow color, and parents are like, put food in it. Baby birds can actually open their beaks wider than adults can, because the corners of their mouths haven't completely fused. And so those corners, when the bill is closed and you're just like looking at their face, those corners are the same color as that mouth lining. So for crows and ravens, the mouth lining color is pink. So if you look at their face, at the corner of the bill of a fledgling crow, it will be pink. The other feature is eyes. So fledgling crows have blue eyes and adults have brown, and it'll make that transition to brown after about 4 months or so. So kind of like end of July, September. There are this is a more subtle tell, but plumage wise, they tend to not be as like brilliantly glossy as an adult. Like it's kind of this dull matte black, kind of gray black sometimes. And then their tails are short. They've got like sometimes short, stumpy tails, depending on how young they are. So those are the features. And then once people can identify them, I really strongly encourage you watch the behavior, because I mean, even after about like 15 minutes, you'll be able to tell that they're young just by how they're acting. Like you can just read it. You can just read the sense of naivete in these birds, because you're just like, all right, only a kid would do that.
Yeah, we can recognize play basically anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I think we have a lot of people that are going to go out in March and June, look for some young crows. That's awesome. So
yeah,
one of the,
and
oh,
so
sorry,
I
go
want
ahead.
really quickly is to just let people know that crows and ravens, and this is true actually of a lot of other songbirds, and crows and ravens are songbirds. Ravens are the biggest songbirds in the world. They really commonly leave the nest before they can fly. That's totally normal. So if you see a baby crow, and as long as it's fully feathered, it can walk fine, it's not bleeding, even if it can't fly, it's totally okay. Its parents are still taking care of it. So please don't try and just like put it in a box and take it to a rehab center, because actually that's totally normal.
So when they're in that state, do they just kind of hop around and then maybe they can fly to like low level bushes type thing?
Exactly. And basically, there reaches a point where there reaches this tipping point basically where it becomes more dangerous to be stuck in the nest, where if a predator sees you, you're like, yikes, well, I have nowhere to go. Versus on the ground where you're still incredibly vulnerable because you can't fly, but at least you can run around, you can hide under a bush, you can sleep in different places at night. So that's basically the strategy that's pushing a lot of these young out, maybe before we think is appropriate, but actually for survival, it's the best strategy. And yeah, they're just kind of like running around like chickens, they're just kind of like hopping around, and they can get to low level branches, and you'll see them sort of practicing flapping their wings. And it, depending on how early they fledged, it can take just a matter of a couple of days before they're flighted, or sometimes weeks.
That's interesting. And that's a good point too. Yeah. People always feel like they should help, but usually nature is pretty good at taking care of itself.
It really is.
So one of the other things that I read, the paper that I had read, was about the conservation behavior, and that it was really a concept that I hadn't come across much before. And like the paper that you had written was sort of introduced me to that concept for the first time. Just talking about how we can help species, not necessarily just crows and ravens, but species live with us as we change the sort of the landscape of the world. Can you talk a little bit about what that's about?
Yeah, so there are, many examples. I'll just list a few where we have conflicts or some kind of conservation issue that we could potentially solve by approaching it from a more cognitive perspective. So, for example, wildlife depredating livestock. That's a human-wildlife conflict. Or wildlife who maybe aren't used to having to deal with a new invasive predator that is now on the landscape because we've introduced it there. So those are two really, and we talk about those in the paper. It was John Marslow was the primary author on that one. And it's basically this idea that, so for example, if you have island species that aren't used to there being rats or cats or mongoose, right? Like one of the major hurdles in progressing their conservation is that you do all of this hard work, raising these animals in captivity, and then you put them out on the landscape and they just get killed immediately, right? Because they don't know how to respond to these predators. But if you can approach that problem from a more cognitive perspective, understanding the things that we do about conditional learning, and like we saw with the crows, right? A lot of if we search for unique ways that animals learn, or unique situations where animals learn about danger, we could maybe use those to help protect them in those situations. Or if we learn things that create fear in animals, non-lethal things, we can use those as ways to keep them away from livestock areas. So there's lots of examples of how we can use learning and cognition to maybe solve some of these conservation problems or some of these human-wildlife conflicts that have otherwise been really challenging.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept, and I think it's probably something that's just relatively new, and it would be really neat for people to pursue that if someone's looking for something to study in school, just because I really enjoyed that concept of these prey animals don't even perceive these predators as being predators, and like you guys show with the crows, it's these animals do somehow communicate and pass along information, and maybe we can share, because we are doing obviously some damage to these environments, which is, there's no question about that, but maybe there's something positive that we can do to help those species survive.
Exactly. And just being more creative in our conservation toolbox.
Very cool. So I want to chat with you just a couple more things. I know we're almost getting to the end of the hour already. I know that you're about to go to Denali to do some research in Alaska. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, like I said, the funeral work that I did, that was all my graduate work. And I graduated with my PhD last August, so in 2018. Now I'm a postdoctorate researcher. And so I've moved on to a new project. And my new project is a joint effort between my university, the University of Washington, and the National Park Service. And the short version of this research study is basically, so a Canada jay is a small corvid. They're adorable and cute, and like look up pictures of them on my Instagram because they're just so cute. But like, one of the things that makes them so amazing is like they're so cute and fluffy, but they're just incredibly robust birds because they're one of the very few species that call Denali and other parts of the high Arctic home year round. They don't migrate away in the winter. They stick it out. And one of the ways that they stick it out is they, during the fall, really intensively cache, meaning store food for later use. And they're not caching it all in one place, the way like a pine squirrel has its little midden and has all of its food stored in one treasure box, so to speak. These birds are making tens of thousands of caches all over their territory. But one of the really interesting things is, unlike a lot of other caching species like chickadees or pinyon jays, the main thing they appear to cache are perishable food items. So things like berries and mushrooms, things that are a little bit more sensitive to changes in temperature. And because we know that the Arctic and sort of high latitude places are feeling the effects of climate change more intensely than further south, specifically warming effects, but also just like, maybe a random temperature spike, even though the temperature could go within a single winter, maybe it just spikes one day, but then it goes down. Those individual spikes may be having sort of increasing rot effects on these perishable food stores. Because what we're seeing is a decline, even though these birds are still abundant and common, we're seeing a trend that worries us in terms of a decline. And so the park identified this sort of, we know we have this truth about what climate change is doing. We see this trend. Let's put in some research to see if these things are linked. And to do that, we need to do some basic just intel to better understand the ecology of birds in this area. And so what my research is just, I go out in the park, I've got a little handheld camcorder, and I just chase these marked banded gray jays around with the camera, filming everything that they do, hoping that I'm catching things like them collecting food and them caching food, so that by the end of this study, we can have this general sense of this is what they eat, this is kind of the breakdown of their diet, this is what they tend to cache, this is where they cache it, right? Like, is it on the exterior or the interior of the tree? Is it underbark? So that future research studies can then say, under maybe different temperature regimes, this is how caches in these different areas will be affected, or, climate changes is going to more impact mushrooms than it is berries. Well, that's a problem because they actually cache a lot of mushrooms, or, those are all hypothetical things, but that's kind of what this research is driving at long term.
Oh, that's very cool. And apparently my fiance's mother went on a cruise on Alaska last summer and did some exploring in Denali Park. And she said it's unbelievable. And when I've heard about it, it definitely became on sort of my bucket list of places to go, because apparently it's just beautiful.
No, it really is. And I really can't stress this enough, because I did the thing that is so hard to do in this day and age, where before I went up to Denali for the first time, my first time was actually in March, which is not the most scenic time to see it because most of the park is closed and everything kind of looks the same because it's covered in snow. But before I went in the fall of last year, I did my best to not just Google a bunch of pictures of the park. So I actually didn't know that much about what I was getting into. And so the first time I went into the park on a bus, I was just like, you just can't, you can't fathom how beautiful it is. Like you take a picture and you're like, this just doesn't even come close. So, and it's really uniquely managed from most other national parks. So it's not just the landscape and the wildlife that's a really interesting experience, but it's also just the experience of, especially if you've ever been to a place like Yellowstone, really seeing the differences in how management can shape your experience.
Right. Well, I'll take that advice. If I ever get to go there, I'll make sure not to look up any pictures between now and then so I can be surprised.
Yeah, and go kind of end of August, early September. That's the absolute most beautiful time to be there.
Very cool. Awesome. And one last thing I want to touch on briefly is I know on your bio, on your website, you do mention that as I think as a high school student, you sort of struggled through school. And now obviously you have this Ph.D. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that because obviously it speaks to finding a passion. I think a lot of people assume that they can't go on and do these academic works if they do struggle in school. But obviously in your case, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So I have diagnosed with ADHD. Well, it was the ADD at the time. Now we call it ADHD and dyslexia. And the combo made school really hard for me. And it made learning to read really hard for me. So I really struggled primarily in kind of primary middle school. And by struggled, I mean like was very nearly held back a grade. I was really routinely failing classes because I was just like, this system is not working for me. And it wasn't really until high school that I had sort of worked through that. And you know, the tricky thing about a story like that is I think for people who are still living that struggle, they want this, they want the life raft. They want the sort of path for how to get out of that. And the problem with these learning disabilities is that they are so individual, right? So I was able to get out of that through, and it's obviously something that I still struggle with. And so when I say get out of it, I mean, you know, gaining the tools that help me navigate a system that's not designed for someone who learns like me. But I was able to do that with the support of my family, you know, a lot of outside help from tutors and all kinds of people, which unfortunately, you know, depending on your family's financial position, you may not have access to, which is such a bummer, right? Because we have these kids that are already vulnerable, and then the kids in the most vulnerable communities may then be made more marginalized because they don't have the resources to get these tools, you know. So anyways, so that's kind of the process that I went through. And fortunately, I was able to sort of figure out I learned how to read eventually. And then I was able to figure out how to manage my time and do a lot of the little things that then culminate in me being able to effectively do work. And so it was in large part because of all of those tools, but I also got to say, time and growth helps a lot. So if you are young and you are in that position, you know, I don't want to co-opt anybody else's slogan, but like things get more helpful. Things improve with time. So just keep pursuing your passions. Because like you said, that is at the end of the day when I was struggling in school and I was like, gosh, this isn't working for me. The thing that kept me happy and grounded was being able to think and learn about animals, right? And fortunately, the people in my life encouraged that. And so because I always had this space of being like, I can learn things and I am into things and I want to pursue those things, that I think for me mentally, that's what really helped me be like, I'm gonna figure this out, and I can, you know, and I know I have that confidence.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I'm sort of not necessarily in the exact same boat, but I struggle with reading myself. Like I am the slowest reader of all time, I think. And I actually failed at a university my first round and got suspended for being so bad at school. And then eventually came back and sort of got everything together and finished my degree and whatnot. But it is that thing where if you are a strong reader, you definitely have a little bit of an advantage because school is very much designed, and it makes sense. It's easier to deliver material that way, but it definitely doesn't, if you're that type of person that struggles with reading or is slow like me, like it takes me forever still to read, you can get through it. But finding something you're interested in definitely helps.
For sure, for sure. And and that that can be sort of a double-edged sword because, I recognize that I got really lucky where I was like, I love crows and I'm going to study those. And there's not very many people that do that. And I was really lucky that I got to do it. But yeah, I think you got to try. You just got to try and stay with what makes you happy and what keeps your brain busy, because otherwise, it's just easy to be like, screw it.
Yeah, I can't do it. Exactly. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to go down an academic pathway at all, but there's there's different paths.
Yeah, and there are so many ways to be a scientist. And anyone that tells you that the only way to be a scientist is to go to school and get a master's and get a Ph.D. is wrong. So don't listen to them. You need that training, but there are so many ways to be involved in science and to communicate science and to be conducting research that don't necessarily have anything to do with an academic path. So if you love animals and studying them, there are tons of different ways to do that.
Totally. I love that. I think that's a great way to finish up here. Can you let everybody know where they can find you online?
Yes, it's very easy. So I am Corvid Research. That's my blog. That's my Twitter handle, my Facebook page, my Instagram handle, and you can find me on Reddit.
Oh, very good.
All at Corvid Research.
Perfect. And I'll make sure everything's in the show notes. And I think one of the things that is interesting on your Instagram page is you have this hashtag crow or no that you've started. And I think it's a little quiz for your people to follow along with.
Yes. So we talked, actually, I don't know that we covered the differences between crows and ravens other than the size, but there are other details, and it's a really common area of confusion for people. And so, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter every Wednesday, I play a game called hashtag crow or no, where I post a picture. You got a 50-50 shot. And then at the end of the game, I walk you through how you could figure it out. And the game is designed to help people learn the difference between crows and ravens, and also just to expose them to all of the great species around the world that are in this genus of birds.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if you want to school your friends on the difference between a crow and raven, you got to start playing so you can learn everything you need to know.
Yeah, exactly, because that's awesome, and who wouldn't want to school their friends in that?
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate that. Hour flew by really fast, and it's really fascinating information.
It was my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
And that brings us to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for listening to that. I hope you really enjoyed that show. And like I said at the beginning, this is one of the first episodes where I've really stepped outside of the reptile world, and I want to continue to do this. Of course, I'm going to obviously revisit reptiles on a regular basis. The next few shows are going to be reptile based, but I do want to step outside of that as often as I can, because conversations like I had with Dr. Swift are really... They can change your perspective, and I think sometimes when we get stuck in one world, we kind of forget what else there is around, and this is one of those conversations that really expanded my mind after this show. Every time I see a crow now, I'm looking for it. I'm trying to watch its behavior, and I hope that you do the same, because that is exactly what I want a listener to get from an episode like this. So there's going to be lots in the show notes. So if you have some more interest on this episode, make sure you go check out the show notes. That will be just animalsathome.ca/podcast. Click on this episode and you'll be able to find everything that you need to know. So I will be revealing the answer to the question that she asked inside the show, which was, what crow species other than the New Caledonian crow has been shown to create tools? So that will be on the show notes. The TED Talk that we referred to during the show will be on the show notes. And in the show notes, I'll also post my favorite video of a crow antagonizing cats. It's kind of a viral video, so I'm sure you've seen it, but we did discuss in the episode how crows like to pull the tails of dogs. Now, this is just a clip of a cat getting its tail pulled by a crow, actually 2 cats. And anyway, I won't spoil it, but it is really funny, and it's pretty crazy. After listening to Dr. Swift explaining that these birds are doing this intentionally, it makes the clip even that much funnier. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Again, if you want to rate the show on the Apple iTunes app, or on iTunes, or on the Apple podcasting app, please give us a 5-star rating if you are enjoying the show. If you want to buy a shirt, go to animalsathome.ca/shop, and you can buy a shirt. $5 does get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy, and we will see you guys next time.